You're muted, Angela.
Am I unmuted?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. Sorry about that. My name is Angela Gartner. I'm the editor of Northeast Ohio Parent Magazine and vice president of the Society of Professional Journalists Cleveland Pro Chapter. We are here. Thank you all for coming to the Crisis in Local News, Reinventing the Business of Journalism webinar. I want to the board of the Society of Professional Journalists wants to thank our partners, Policymakers Ohio, League of Women Voters of Greater Cleveland, Eye on Ohio, Ohio Center for Investigative Journalism, the Double Strip, and Common Cause. Just to let you know what the format's going to be tonight is we are as you see on the screen, we have presenters from all of our partners, and each panelist will give a presentation. And after we hear from all the panelists, we will take questions from the audience. You can type your questions throughout the presentations in the Q&A. So we plan to go to about 8 o'clock. We're definitely gonna we wanna have time for questions, but so we're gonna go ahead and get started with our first two presenters. We have Caitlin Johnson, who is the communication director, and Zach Schiller, who is the research director of Policymakers Ohio. And they're gonna go ahead and share some information with us. So, Caitlin, to you.
Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. Give me just a sec while I get my screen share together, but I'll just introduce myself really quick. I'm the communications director of Policymakers Ohio. If you're a member of the press, you've probably been harassed by me one time or another. I'm also a former journalist. That's what I first did when I got out of college, worked in journalism for, I don't know, 6 years or so, most recently at WCPN, but before that, I was at Now on PBS, which is a now off the air show, and I worked at a daily newspaper called the Patriot Ledger outside of Boston. And I'm with Zach Schiller, and he's our research director, and he's also a veteran journalist, 20 years, Plain Dealer, Business Week, and Zach can tell you a little bit more about himself. But now I'm going to get my screen share going. Okay. So there we are. I already told you about that, told you all about us. You probably, if you're in the press, you probably know about us anyway, because we bother you sometimes. And we are a nonprofit research institute. And one of our core beliefs is that government and the public sector can and should take an active role in making people's lives better and making communities stronger. And so, like I described earlier, we care about newspapers from a self-interested point of view. We use newspapers all the time to get our information out there. But also, if we care about government and care about the role it can play in society, we will have to care about newspapers and local news, because local news makes government work better. We did a paper last year that was inspired by the announcement that the Youngstown Vindicator would close. And Zach and I, being former reporters, were really concerned about this. So we started to look into the industry in Ohio. And part of that paper was a lit review of sorts of all the different things that the different benefits newspapers bring to our communities. If you're on this webinar, you care about the news, most likely you probably know this, makes government more accountable, lower municipal debt. There have been studies that show municipal debt goes up when local newspapers close. Local news helps voter turnout. Voter turnout goes down when newspapers close. And you also see people becoming much more hyper-partisan, which is a big problem today. When local news outlets close, the void starts to get filled by really partisan national news sources like Fox News on the right, or maybe an MSNBC on the left. And recently I wrote a blog updating our report, taking a little bit more of a deeper look at the public health angle that was also mentioned in our report. People who work for an organization called Health Map, they track the spread of disease, and they are able to find the roots of outbreaks. They have been, they actually found that local news is a really important source at getting to the root of root causes of different outbreaks that you don't necessarily get from government data. So some epidemiologists at a organization called Health Map, when they learned that local newspapers were closing all over the country and there are going to be all sorts of news deserts out there, they became really concerned, because local news is a important way they figure out what is happening with disease. And one of the examples they pointed to was local newspapers helped figure out that this mumps outbreak that was happening in Arkansas a few years ago was traced back to this Marshallese immigrant community. Even though the children were getting vaccinated, some of the older people that moved to Arkansas weren't. And so it created this whole outbreak that spread into the community. And once they were able to figure that out, they were able to deal with it. But it was newspapers that really gave the epidemiologists that info. So lots of reasons newspapers are important. Like I said, probably don't need to tell you all of that. But what we found in our data and analysis with our report, and we look at job numbers all the time. We look at Bureau of Labor Statistics data to figure out what industries are growing and what industries are losing jobs. And so we used that same data and applied it to the newspaper industry. And what we found is that in Ohio, there are 58% fewer jobs in the newspaper industry between 2004 and 2017. And that is a huge drop in that time span. We wanted to look a little bit more closely at the newsroom jobs, which are the reporters, the editors, the photographers, graphic designers, the people that are really synthesizing and reporting the news and putting it in a form that we can understand, to see what happened with those jobs. So we have there, as you break it down, and this is just a 6-year time frame, so it's even perhaps more stunning than the 58% drop. 43% of all newsroom jobs gone or dropped. Newsroom jobs fell by 43% in that 6-year time span. And we're also seeing, because like I said, I was a reporter, also seeing the pay is dropping for newspaper reporters, editors, and photographers, which is a big concern, because a lot of these jobs expect college degrees, they expect a car, they expect to work at off hours, and then they're also expecting people to be multimedia versatile, to be able to take photographs, to shoot video, all sorts of things. But we're seeing jobs are getting cut, and pay is getting lower and lower for a lot of these professionals, and they are professionals. And one anecdote that I like to share is I looked on journalismjobs.com while we were writing this, and I saw a newspaper reporter opening in Logan County, and the pay was just over $22,000 a year. So that I think that would put you in a category, if you were supporting a family of 3, that you would need to get federal food assistance to be able to get by. So that just shows you these are paying at or near poverty wages in a lot of cases. So why is this happening? Why are we seeing the industry that's so important, that makes our communities better? Why are we seeing it suffering so much? Well, of course, a lot of it is that the newspaper industry hasn't done a great job of adjusting to changing times. And there has been a huge loss in ad revenue. And a lot of that ad revenue has been sucked up by some digital behemoths like Facebook and Google. In 2018, digital ad revenue hit about $100 billion. And the lion's share of that went to Facebook and Google, and especially in local markets, it's like 60% overall. In local markets, it's 77%. And newspapers made a lot of money off of their classified advertising. A lot of that has shifted to online as well. And one study showed that if Craigslist opens up in a city, you see newspapers are more likely to close down. So that's been a huge blow to the newspaper industry. So you have that going on, but then meanwhile, as newspapers are suffering, hedge funds and private equity firms, they smell blood in the water, and a lot of them own multimedia conglomerates. And so while they see that newspapers are struggling, it's an opportunity to come in, wring out as much profit as possible, consolidate operations, and just like I said, draw all of the profit they possibly can. And the University of North Carolina, which does an amazing analysis of the newspaper industry nationwide, said that this merger, consolidation, hedge fund driven stuff, it's nowhere is it more intense in the nation than it is in Ohio. And we recently had a pretty dramatic example of that when Gatehouse and Gannett merged. And Yosef can probably, it's Gannett, Gatehouse, Gannett bought Gatehouse. I'll probably get this wrong. Yosef can, but they're one company now. And they own the Dispatch, the Beacon Journal, the Cincinnati Enquirer, the Canton Repository. There's about 50 or 60 small papers throughout the state that they own. And this is a map that we made on Tableau before the merger happened. So just understand this is all one color now, but just shows you the circulation of all these papers that they own. So you can see it's about like a quarter of the state, I believe, is served by these newspapers. And so that's like one company controlling a huge amount of information that all Ohioans are consuming. So I think I laid out the problem. Now I'm going to turn it over to Zach, who has some solutions. So Zach, take it away.
Okay, well, some solutions. I think also here in Cleveland, of course, we're all too aware of the cutbacks and layoffs that we've seen just in the last few weeks. I want to talk about a few things. The first is public radio. And Ohio actually has a long history of supporting public radio, goes back many decades. And this is just a list that shows you this current fiscal year, how much the state of Ohio is spending to support public radio, including the State House News Bureau, which many of us hear all the time, but also subsidies to local stations. These are not large sums, but on the other hand, I think it shows you that public radio can be supported, public broadcasting and journalism in general can be supported by the government without it interfering with news coverage. I don't think anyone accuses Karen Kassler of having a bias and having interviews of Larry Obhoff, the Senate president, that are more or less favorable than the Senate Minority Leader, Kenny Yuko. They pretty much look at all of them. So I think it demonstrates that that concern can be addressed and we can see greater investments. Next slide, please. So what are some more specific examples? Well, I mean, I think as I began to indicate, we could see much more support for public broadcasting. There's currently an effort going on among some of the major public radio stations in Ohio to develop a statewide collaboration, which we're hoping will lead to more opportunities and more coverage, but which obviously needs more than $70,000 in foundation funding to really get going. I think that, you know, with the COVID-19, this whole, what Caitlin described earlier has ratcheted up to a new level where we're seeing huge numbers of new layoffs, of cutbacks just in the past month or so, which further endangers the citizenry and the public for the reasons she described. And so what I think we need is the next stimulus act, which the Congress is working on now, needs to include major funding, meaning billions of dollars, for newspapers and nonprofit outlets alike. However, as we've seen, some of the leading newspaper companies are not particularly interested in the public interest. I think we've seen here in Cleveland some of the union busting activity at the Plain Dealer. I don't think that the public should be supporting companies that would simply take this money and put it in their shareholders' pockets or use it to keep their employees from having good representation. So what I would say is let's have several $billion that's supplied, but let's make it with some promises that they don't lay reporters off, that they don't engage in anti-union activity, that they don't give dividends or stock buybacks, and so that the public is the one that's actually benefiting from this activity. There also has been legislation that would allow traditional media enterprise to become nonprofits. And we've seen a few major newspapers that have moved in that direction, the Philadelphia Inquirer, the Salt Lake City Tribune. Here too, there need to be some guardrails to be sure that they actually are operating in the public interest, but it perhaps may allow for a little more avenue for some traditional newspapers. I think also, as Caitlin indicated, where has the money gone? The money has gone to Facebook and Google. And while they too are seeing some reduction in advertising, I don't think that it's reducing them as a share of the total. And frankly, we need to tax them. And we could do that. We could raise a couple of $2 billion a year in revenue, and it could be used for an endowment to support independent journalism of all kinds. And that could include, I think, some of what we're going to hear about later from some of the other participants. Next slide, please. So that was a description of what Congress could do. There are also some things that our state policymakers can do. One is that they can boost support of public broadcasting. We proposed that last summer when the Vindicator went out of business, or at least as it was, went out of business. The state is spending $20 million a year on subsidies to Amazon, Facebook, other operators of big cloud computing centers who have very little employment. We could take that money and use it to support public broadcasting or other nonprofit journalism. I think another thing that could be very useful, and we've seen the major newspaper association and the broadcasters and others coming forward and asking for this as well, is to allow for government ad dollars to be used to spend them in local journalism outlets, including community journalism, minority-owned outlets. Make sure that, as de Blasio has done in New York City recently, and indicating there that the city should spend its ad dollars on community media. We need vast amounts to be, I've been spending a lot of time looking into unemployment compensation, where we've had almost 900,000 people file in the past 4 weeks. Hardly anybody knows how this operates. They don't know what's available to them. They don't know how to do it. They're frustrated because they can't get through. The state should have a major promotion program that explains how this program and other public benefits work. And they should allow that to go to local media, which will allow them also to keep their reporters and others on staff. This too could include nonprofits and cooperatives. Finally, we have seen some state initiatives, particularly in New Jersey. There was something started called the Civic Information Collaborative, which is an effort that hasn't gotten quite as much funding as it needs, but nevertheless tries to bring together journalism with higher education and community organizations. It requires all three to be involved before it gives grants. And they can use that to train new journalists, to figure out new ways to raise revenue for journalism, for all kinds of different collaborations to create new products and new forms of journalism, which is of course what we need. So there is no shortage of new ideas for ways that journalism can be supported. I think what's needed, however, is a major public investment to do so, because this is not being solved by the market. We can see right now that has been a failure. We need to come up with public resources for it. And compared to the $2 trillion that is being spent just in the current CARES Act, a few billion is not a whole lot. So that concludes my presentation. I'm eager to hear the other participants.
Okay, thank you so much, Zach and Caitlin. We're going to hear from Lucia she's the executive director of Eye on Ohio, and she's talking about bringing nonprofit news to Ohio. And we're excited to hear her presentation as well.
Alright. Well, good evening, Ohio. Thank you so much for having me here. No, that's not it. Ah, that button. So I represent Eye on Ohio. I'm the executive director, and I'm so sorry Dwayne Pullman couldn't be here with tonight. So first, to start out, and a lot of this Policy Matters did a great job of showing you, but I just wanted to emphasize it here again. So, before, obviously, newspapers relied very heavily on advertising, but really they're kind of serving two markets, right? Both advertising and, that civic. So this second part, the civic value, transparency, government accountability, all that, that's the value that we bring as a news nonprofit. Really, universities are the best nonprofits. What's the ROI on a kid learning Plato, right? But at the same time, we really need these institutions where people are learning and researching and helping our kids succeed. And obviously they did it much better. I have too much text, so this is I'm going to go through really quickly, but obviously, we have a lot of information out there that, corruption increases when there's no one there to ask tough questions. One of the things that I couldn't believe was, that municipalities have higher borrowing costs, but, it makes sense because you don't have someone there going, well, why are we paying for this? Why are we paying for that? Which is kind of watchdog journalism 101. This is sort of ironic. Facebook wanted to do this local news thing, except they couldn't find enough local news. Even the new local news that they could find, because they wanted to represent the country evenly. I don't know if you actually read it. It was all crime stories from 3 days ago. Like there was no sort of new stuff there. So Ohio, obviously, we talked about, it has a lot of consolidation. A lot of people don't realize a for-profit company legally can't, unless it's a B corporation or a benefit corporation. They're two different things, but they aren't able to look at their they have to look at their shareholders first legally. So that's kind of where we see a lot of this. Eye on Ohio is the only statewide nonprofit news source. We provide all our articles free of charge to any publication that wants to do it. We've got a republish button. You can put it on your blog if you want. So far, we've been republished in 73 different newspapers and radio stations, reaching a peak audience of 2.5 million. That's actually mostly radio, because we have obviously a lot of fans in NPR and so on and so forth. As long as they cite us, and obviously we try to work with as many local media partners as we possibly can. And we're committed to being a business incubator. This is just a GIF from a local project that we worked on property records. We're always trying to do what can we do. We try to do a lot with data journalism and trying to see if we can do more with less, because we have to. We're part of the Institute for Nonprofit News. They're a separate nonprofit, but they provide us with tech support. They provide us with trainings and marketing materials, and they provide us with basically a network of, we're not reinventing the wheel. We're a state organization like a lot of other state organizations. So this is based on their executive summary. So obviously this is going to be way out of date because of the coronavirus, but so these are the state organizations that they have, and we'll go through some of the more successful ones. This just kind of gives you a flavor of how nonprofit news has grown in America. About a third of them are state or local. That's usually a city type of one. Even the national ones, even if they're national, the really only big national one is ProPublica. But it'll be a national one like the Marshall Project does an awesome job. They have like a $10 million budget, but they just concentrate on, jails and prisons and criminal justice news. So you can see they mostly cover these areas where, you see that public service journalism can really make an impact: government policy, environment, government oversight, politics, education, schools, and revenue streams, mostly foundations, but also a huge chunk of that is the community themselves. And I'm sure Chris can talk about this a lot more with you, but individual giving and membership. This just kind of gives you an idea. They actually don't tell you the name of the place when you fill out the thing, but you can at least kind of get an idea of how other places are going. So you can see there's this is a huge new business, but it's kind of the Wild West of journalism. There's on average 8 people. The median is 6, but there's a huge standard of deviation. So some of them, and these are all separate, part of the same network, but separate in terms of funding. So we see some really big ones and some really small ones. Michigan does a great job. This is where I usually get all my Ohio people, because I say Michigan is kicking our butts. We need to get on here. They've done a great job in terms of reader donation growth and also engaging local foundations. Oklahoma Watch, I actually I wrote a bit for them just as a freelancer. I moved here from Oklahoma to take this job, so I guess I'm a little biased, but I think they do a fabulous job. The VT Digger, they are amazing. They have more readers than the population of Vermont, so obviously they go quite outside their boundaries, unless every man, woman, and child in Vermont is swiping. But it's really interesting to see their growth, and also they do a really good job of sort of breaking it down by showing that they have membership, major gifts, foundations, and so forth. And then the biggest state one is the Texas Tribune. I actually just went there in October for a collaborative learning thing, which was phenomenal. They do just an amazing job, and we hope to expand our coverage there. And so that's about it. I know I kind of went through all of nonprofit news really quickly in Ohio, but we're very happy to serve our readers and our community here. And we're very small compared to most other outlets, but obviously there's a huge need in Ohio, and we're hoping to grow in the future.
Thank you. And just a reminder, please make sure to ask your questions in the Q&A. Everybody will have time to answer questions to all of our panelists. So make sure to ask your questions in the Q&A. The next person who's going to speak is from Common Cause. He's Yosef is going to talk to us a little bit, and I'm just going to let you take it away, Yosef.
Great. Thanks, Angela, and thanks to all the partners for organizing this really timely webinar. I hope everyone watching at home is staying safe in these really uncertain times. My name is Yosef Getachew. I am the director of the Media and Democracy program at Common Cause. Common Cause, for those who don't know, is a nonprofit organization that's focused on holding power accountable and infusing our values of democracy in our policymaking. Media and Democracy, our Media and Democracy program really focuses on promoting open and affordable communication services and making sure that there are diverse and independent voices in our media ecosystem. Our key campaigns focus on fighting for net neutrality, making sure everyone has internet access, and combating the ongoing media consolidation. So why do we care about journalism? Why do most of you care about journalism? If we were actually in person, I would have taken an informal survey asking folks in the audience who regularly watches their local TV station for news or who regularly reads the local newspaper. Usually there's a fair amount of folks to raise their hand. And I would follow up and ask how many people know what's going on in their communities, whether it's the school board, the housing authority, the town hall, the mayor's office. And more than often than not, most people won't raise their hands because they really don't know what's going on. And this really speaks to the state of our current news and information system. As Caitlin and others have really laid out, there have been so many newspapers that have shuttered across the country and so much consolidation that has taken place that's really diminished the amount of news and information that our communities get. And as Caitlin and others have said, the less news that we receive at the local level, it directly impacts our ability to vote, to civically engage, to know what's going on in our communities, and to be active participants. So really our focus at Common Cause is to make sure that there is strong, sustainable journalism to support our democracy across all communities. And we do this a lot through consolidation or fighting consolidation. Before I talk about that, I do want to highlight that the COVID pandemic that we are currently experiencing has accelerated the decline in local news. If folks have been reading some of the stories, they've seen that so many newspapers are struggling financially more than ever because of cratering advertising revenue. And it's even affected places in Ohio. I've seen the City Beat in Cincinnati, Ohio, have to furlough a few reporters and force a few reporters to take pay cuts. The Cleveland Scene in Ohio laid off about 5 staffers. The Cleveland Plain Dealer, I think last week or not too long ago, laid off a majority of its staff. This was, from what I'm understanding, not related to COVID, but the fact that it took place around the time of the pandemic just speaks to the financial hardships that much of our news and information is going through right now. So instead of speaking more about the challenges, I do want to focus a bit on our work at Common Cause and give a case study in how we're trying to fight back against some of the consolidation that's going on in our media landscape right now. And one story I'll highlight is our work in Dayton, Ohio. If folks didn't know, there was a big media merger that was taking place in Dayton, Ohio last year, as well as other parts of the country. This was Apollo's takeover of Cox's media assets. Apollo is a private equity firm that is notorious for taking over distressed assets and essentially chopping them up, similar to other private equity firms. And Apollo has never really been in the media business before, but they saw that there were still some lucrative opportunities to acquire media, and so they decided to buy Cox. Now, if there's any folks in the audience that live in Dayton, they'll know that the Dayton Daily newspaper has been owned by Cox for well over 100 years. At the same time, Cox has owned the largest TV station in Dayton, as well as a handful of radio stations. So essentially, all of that media that's been owned by Cox for so long was being sold to a private equity firm that, one, had no idea how the community operated, and two, had no interest in actually providing local news and information to that community. So we at Common Cause organized a town hall in Dayton last year to really highlight the dangers of this merger and really make sure that people were aware of what was going on. And there was a lot of concern. There was over 100 folks who showed up. Hundreds of folks raised their concerns with the FCC, which is the agency that oversees a lot of these media mergers and approves them. To fast forward the story a little bit, after we had formally opposed the merger, we had seen that Apollo and Cox had their merger approved by the FCC, unfortunately. However, this merger approval coincided with a lawsuit that Common Cause filed at the Third Circuit. So while all this consolidation has been going on, we've also seen the FCC relax so many media ownership rules that allow entities like Apollo to jump in and just take over all the media in one market. And so we sued the FCC and told the courts, hey, the FCC just can't roll back these rules and allow these big corporations to take over all the local media. And we won. It was a great victory for us, a great victory for a lot of communities who want independent sources of news. Unfortunately for Apollo, our victory coincided with the FCC approving their merger. And so because we got the rules back in place, Apollo had to figure out how could they own all this media in Dayton and still comply with the rules. One of these rules is the newspaper broadcast cross ownership rule. And in simple terms, it basically means you can own a TV station and a newspaper in the same market because that's just too much ownership under one entity. And Apollo was trying to own the Dayton Daily newspaper and the largest TV station in Dayton, which was blatantly against the rules. So Apollo tried to negotiate with the FCC to say, hey, look, just let us own this and we'll cut the publication of the newspaper to 3 days a week in order to comply with your rule. And the FCC approved it. And so we had a situation where the FCC was legitimately saying, we are going to cut the publication of a newspaper just to get a merger approved. Common Cause and a lot of our allies made a lot of noise about this. We wrote op-eds and we got the president's attention that, hey, a newspaper was losing publication. And so the pressure we raised actually forced the sale of the newspaper back to Cox. Cox stepped in and said, okay, we'll take over the newspaper and we'll maintain a 7-day-a-week publication. So it's definitely a small but important victory in making sure that there's at least some level of independence between Cox, between the Dayton Daily newspaper and other media in Dayton. But to get back to the larger narrative, it just shows what's going on in many communities, that consolidation is harming the amount of news and information that folks are getting and ultimately harming our democracy. So we're fighting these mergers and we're pushing for strong rules to prevent these from happening. But we also know that outside of that, there's this larger issue of changing business models. The advertising model is just not working anymore. Caitlin and others have really laid out the fact that you have platforms taking over much of the advertising revenue. So we're trying to figure out, what does journalism look like in the digital age? How can we get journalism in a place where people can get the news and information they need, and you're building sustainable models where journalism isn't bankrupt? And so it's an ongoing conversation, and we have a few ideas. We recently wrote to Congress with a few of our allies asking for at least $5 billion in funding in the next stimulus package to support local news outlets. This just speaks to the larger crisis of journalism right now and the fact that they are hurting for advertising revenue and shuttering in many cases. And we can't have local news dying out during a pandemic when people need accurate and trustworthy sources of news to know what's going on in their communities.
Thank you, Yosef. That's definitely important information. And I think we're all looking to figure out ways to fight and advocate for journalism. So I'm looking forward. We have a lot of good questions coming in, and we're going to be asking some good questions to you and everyone else on the panel. So we're going to move to our last panelist right now, which is Chris Horne from the Devil Stripe, and he's going to be talking to us right now.
Hello, I'm Chris Horne. Can everyone hear me? Okay, good. All right. My name is Chris Horne. I'm the publisher of the Devil Strip. The Devil Strip is a local news cooperative in Akron, Ohio, and we started off as an arts, culture, music kind of publication, a little bit like the Cleveland Scene, and have branched more into local news over the last couple of years. I'll get into a lot more about who we are and what we do, but I kind of want to start by being a little bit contrarian because it makes me happy to be so. I think there's a lot of money still to be made in local news, and I think the evidence of that is that you have hedge funds and investor-owned companies in this space. The caveats to that statement, though, are that one, they don't think there's enough money to be made in local news, at least enough to make them rich. And then the other caveat The way that they make money on local news is not to invest in the quality of local news. But people in your community still have information needs that they want addressed, want served. And I think there's still a lot of room to do that kind of work. At least that's our basic hypothesis, right? Otherwise, why would we be doing this? So when I'm thinking about, how do we reinvent the business of local journalism, I kind of start from this place with how well do we understand the business of journalism? I know everything that Kaylin and Zach and everybody else has said, absolutely true. Especially the consequences in detailing what has happened. But all of this is based around a model that we keep investing in instead of moving away from, the attention model, right? So we try to attract as much attention as possible, then we harvest it so we can sell it to advertisers. And that is sort of generally our model. Obviously, what Lucia is doing and other nonprofit newsrooms are doing a little different because it's nonprofit and you're going for donors and fund foundations. But fundamentally, like we are kind of stuck in this box where we need to do this broadcast work, where we need to reach as many people and get as many eyeballs. And on the journalism side, we tend to tell ourselves this is because we can have the most impact that way. But it's really a business decision. Things like crime reporting evolved, 200 years ago just to get eyeballs. It wasn't a journalistic response, right? And I think that a lot of things that we've fallen into the habit of on the editorial side actually originated as business needs or business desires. So understanding how the business has influenced the editorial is really important. It's obvious when we're looking at newsrooms like the Plain Dealer getting just slashed mercilessly, slashed into pieces. It's easy to see the impact of the business on the editorial in that way, but it's there regardless. It's been there for decades. When all of this mess started, and it wasn't that they were cutting back newsrooms 20 years ago so that they could make money. It was so they could make more money. So for example, when Black Press owned the Akron Beacon Journal, they cut back, I think 40 people as their first wave shortly, maybe just months after they first bought the paper, cut 40 positions in the newsroom because their profit margin had dipped below 20%. And 20% on a daily product is an insane amount of money. It is an insane amount of money. Grocery stores make about 2%, about 10 times less, 2% on their daily products. And that's just barely getting by. So we had newsrooms that operated a lot more like grocery stores. Then I think we'd see a lot more high quality journalism, and we'd start seeing a lot more audience response, a lot more market response. So the idea of market failure, I think the market failures on the advertising side, the appetite there is strong for the attention that local markets have. But the market hasn't failed in the local news sense. People still want that information. So one of the things that we have done at the Devil Strip is focus intently on, I think what I think of as the second layer of local news. Now, the first layer of local news is what's happening, right? What happened today or what happened in the past, and let's dig into that. Vitally important. But the one that we tend to overlook is who are we, especially when we're talking about local news. That layer, who are we as a people, as a community, as a city, is vitally important because, well, the most important story we ever tell is the one we tell ourselves about ourselves. That's the story that dictates our behavior, it guides our behavior. It's the one that shapes the story we tell about other people, and that story guides how we treat them. And so thinking about who it is that we are as a people, what are the things in a city that make it unique? Who are the people who are active and involved and engaged? There's an element of journalism that is just vicarious experience. It helps people see, just like in a novel or a TV show or a movie, what it's like to do something, right? And so we have focused on doing that kind of work. And a lot of the reason is just because I had worked in legacy newsrooms for about a decade before I started the magazine, and had increasingly gotten disenchanted with the work that I was doing. Tons of talented, passionate people who cared about the community, cared about the craft, who were being asked to do things that were, I think, primarily to get attention that would pad the bottom line. So, and I apologize, I'm just rambling at this point. and I'm a little bit cynical, if you can't tell. It's been a long day. I want to just go into the co-op thing real quick. So we started the magazine as a for-profit, mostly because it was easy to do. We've never made a profit. I didn't pay myself for 4 years. But we operated as a for-profit mostly because it was easy to do. In February, we officially became a community-owned cooperative, which means the people in Akron own a share of the magazine, and they are now our boss. Whereas the magazine had been mine entirely, it now belongs to people who live in Akron. One share, one vote. And our membership model is such that for as little as $1 a month, you have voting rights. So we've tried to lower the threshold for participation to allow as many people in as possible. It follows the way that we have worked editorially. When I started the magazine, I didn't have any startup capital, so couldn't hire a big old staff of professional journalists, and instead decided to take my chances with the people of Akron and try to get them to tell the story of the city, in part because I was new, still new. I've only been here for 6 years. So I didn't know a whole lot about the city of Akron. My curiosity was legit, but I didn't know anything. And I needed people who were from Akron, who had lived in Akron, who fell in love with Akron to be able to go and do that work. And doing that, getting them to participate, we sort of lowered the barriers between the newsroom and the community and made our interest similar, at least parallel. And the co-op followed that because ownership dictates the way your organization operates. Obviously, if you're investor owned, they are trying to make as much money as possible. There's nothing wrong with that. That's just the business it is, right? But it clearly has an impact on the way the organization works. If it's a nonprofit, it's more mission oriented. That has an impact on the way that your operation works. With the co-op model, being community owned means that, I hope it means that we will always be in alignment with our community's best interest. Right now, we're still finishing up the bylaws. I mean, the COVID kind of put us back off track a little bit, but we have a board of people who are just regular community members who are trying to help make this thing better. So I will stop rambling. I could talk all day, especially if you let me. So I'll stop there, and I guess we'll start taking questions.
Okay.
Cool.
Thank you, Chris. Appreciate you being here and sharing your information. We're going to take some questions from some of the attendees, but the first question I want to ask you all before we start into the question is, how can we really change the business model of journalism? I know we've talked about it, but what right now is being done to really change the business model? And especially to Policy Matters, who, you had a lot of great recommendations, and is there any progress on those right now?
Well, I think that this is a real opportunity in that, as terrible and awful as COVID-19 has been, and obviously the deaths, the public health, the social distancing, I mean, this is not a happy situation. That said, I think that it creates such a crisis that it's becoming more clear that some really significant changes are going to happen. And so while I don't exactly support the Newspaper Industry Association and the National Association of Broadcasters, the very idea that they've even sought $5 to $10 billion in federal money, why is the journalism industry any different than the airline industry? And so I think that there is a real opportunity to see things in a new way. And so maybe the crisis is an opportunity. That said, I mean, I think we're seeing more of the same, and it can continue. It's not as if it's fated for us to come up with a new model, that's for sure. Because what we've seen here in Ohio just recently, and here in Cleveland just recently, has certainly been, incredibly depressing. And so it's definitely a crapshoot, but I think there really is that opportunity.
Yeah, there are some proposals that have been made around the stimulus. And we shared out in the chat, which is what the News Guild is, kind of their action alert, and you can fill it out, and it will send a letter to your congressional representative asking them to include journalism in the News Guild, but sorry, in the stimulus. But yeah, like Zach mentioned a couple of proposals. Some people are saying the federal government should, I think it's Report for America, which is kind of like the Teach for America, but it's reporters being put in different communities. They're calling for 500 million, I believe, to be spent in public health advertising, something Zach talked about. And then Free Press, which is an advocacy, they're doing community organizing around journalism. Their executive director called for, I believe it was 5 billion.
5 billion.
5 billion.
So that was a letter we just sent to Congress based off of that figure.
Yeah. So somebody asked a question. I think Stephen asked in the Q&A, what can people do? So I'd say, go to that action alert with that we put in the chat, which is the News Guild's thing that you can fill out and send a letter. And you can also, call your members of Congress and ask them to support funding for journalism in the next stimulus. And there are a couple of different proposals on the table.
And there was also a question regarding nonprofit, and Lucia, this would be for you. Lucia, how does Eye on Ohio raise money? Has it ever organized a fund driver like public radio, TV? Also, has it ever considered establishing a paywall, or is it not allowed by is it not allowed by a nonprofit?
Well, Stephen, thank you so much for your question. I swear I don't know him, but this is a great plan. Yes, we do have fundraising drives. Our biggest fundraising drive is always at the end of the year. Because of COVID, we're having another fundraising drive, May 5th through the 7th. So May 5th, 6th, 7th, we'll have another fundraising drive. And just like the slides that I showed you, we're mostly foundation funded, but obviously, we rely heavily on our community too. All our 990s are public. You can find them on GuideStar. In fact, that reminds me, we just filed our taxes, so I have to put the next one up there. But we obviously try to be very transparent. Every foundation who's ever donated to us, and I think it's people above $5,000. Although honestly, I think I put everyone up there, is on our donation site. We've the nice thing about being part of the INN network is, we're not, reinventing the wheel. Publications that have had syndication haven't really made any money doing that. So 2 reasons. One, we don't charge for our content because, we're here because all these places, are cutting back on journalists. So if they, if they wanted to, if they had the budget, they would just hire another journalist. They wouldn't have to partner with us, and we understand that. And then 2, it's really hard to go to a, most nonprofits like the fact that everything is free and available to the public. So that's a big selling point for them. So that's a big selling point for us as well.
Can you tell us a little bit about the model? We know that Salt Lake City Tribune uses the not-for-profit model. There was a question on that. Can you tell us a little bit about how the model works?
Sure. So they're a great example. They pretty much the only thing that they had to do was get rid of their editorial content. And there's so many blogs online. You really don't need that. We don't have any editorial content on our website. Just because, we try to be nonpartisan as much as possible. And 2, we just don't have the budget, and we wanted to focus on reporting the news as much as possible. So actually, Fraser Nelson, I just saw her in October, the Salt Lake Tribune, has done a really great job of, transitioning, and, but they still have that So basically they transitioned their, anyone who's subscribing is now a member, which is the same for us. Like if you donate at all, you're part of our membership. But, if you cannot afford it, then that's fine. You fill out a form and you can get, I believe that's how it works. Then you can get access to it for free. So, they can kind of the best of both worlds there, where you can be a member and still subscribe to the newspaper if you want. And, you're still supporting the cause, as it were, or you can donate over that. And if you can't afford it, you can still get it.
If I could just add to that real quick. So my understanding is when you transition to nonprofit, you actually have to file for 501c3 status. So you're treated like any other nonprofit organization. And in addition to that, your revenue stream switches from charging customers to finding out how to make money other ways. So that's going to donors, going to foundations, accepting donations, things like that. So you have to find multiple revenue streams to achieve sustainability. And in addition to that, I think there's constant experimentation with the news you are putting out to make sure that your members are engaging with it. And I think that's how you show funders and donors, hey, look, we're attracting an audience here and building out like that. I think there are strong examples, Salt Lake City Tribune, ProPublica. I think there's one in Texas, I can't remember the name of it. So there are strong examples. I just think it works on a community by community basis.
Yeah, and nonprofit does not mean non-revenue. Sometimes it's hard for people to understand. It's not a business model, nonprofit. It's just a legal structure, and it just affects your taxes, and it affects where you can give that money, and you don't have shareholders.
Well, another question for the panelists. What can we do to get younger people to read and subscribe to newspapers that they are comfortable and knowledge about? They're comfortable about and knowledge about social media, but not necessarily traditional newspapers. How can we kind of change that story?
May I?
Yeah, anyone can answer.
Okay. Are you doing work that they care about? There's a lot of beauty in the serendipity of print, and this is one of the reasons we have a print edition every month. And I think that there's a lot of wonderful opportunity to bump into things that you would otherwise ignore, especially in this digital age. But fundamentally, are you doing work that they care about? And I would say that for anyone you're looking at in your community, not just young people. Specifically with the Devil Strip, we target people who do not have, I am sorry, Carrie, I'll speak up. We target people who do not have a regular news habit, which at this point, maybe everybody, maybe a lot of people anyway, non-journalists. And the reason for that is because the way that a lot of the news has been structured, we see research on news avoidance rising and news fatigue rising. And so, what can we do to get people interested in the stories that we're telling, so that they'll care when we hold power to account, or we try to inform the public about meaningful issues. And that's another reason why we take the approach we do, telling stories about arts, culture, music, food, small businesses, etc. Because it's the identity of the place where we live. So I think that's one way, and we've had a lot of success with it where we are. So, but I am not a young person anymore, so I have no idea.
Yeah, plus one to everything Chris said. I think part of the challenge is getting journalists and news outlets to engage with the younger generation. If you look at Pew reports, they show that you are more likely to have spoken with a reporter if you are an old white man. So if you're a person of color, you're probably not going to hear from a reporter, which means they're not telling your stories, or they're not telling your stories in a way that reflects the accuracy of your experiences. And so if they're not seeing their stories in the news, they're not going to read the news. Beyond that, though, I think that the real challenge isn't getting students or getting younger people to read newspapers. It's getting news outlets to transition to the digital age where you're creating a functional business model online. So it's not that I'm a young person, I'm scrolling through Facebook to just get status updates from my friends. I'm looking at news links that friends are sharing with me. So what are those news links? How are they getting shared? and are outlets able to sustain their stories online, whether that's through Facebook and Google and getting a better share of advertising revenue? Is it a situation where they have to go through their own website? So you have websites like BuzzFeed News that have tried to do digital content online with some success, but there's no sustainable model out there yet. So that's something we have to figure out.
Rachel Dissel has a question. I'm interested in models that are rooted in equality and that could support a staff that reflects the community served racially, ethically, and socioeconomically. Also that doesn't rely on freelancers who often can't make a reliable income. Can anyone speak to her question? Does that sound crazy, she says?
Hell no, it doesn't sound crazy. It sounds amazing. And I don't want to like monopolize the conversation, but I mean, and I've had some conversation with Rachel and admire the hell out of the work she's done. So it's nice to see her on the call. Yeah, no, I mean, this is another part of the reason we are a co-op, and I'll address the freelancer thing sort of parallel to that. But you know, being a cooperative, you know, it has to be part of our mission to truly reflect I took out the head plug. Sorry there, Carrie. I think that my microphone thing was busted. Yeah, we have to reflect, as part of our mission, to reflect the city of Akron and its people accurately, equitably, inclusively. And one of the ways that we do that is by inviting the people in our community into our newsroom to participate. And so our freelancers aren't, freelancers in the sense that we typically think about them as like, journalists who are trying to make a living, taking and pitching and trying to make a living that way. There are some folks that we work with that way. But a lot of them are just folks who every so often I want to help tell a story. Others are people who didn't know that they would like journalism. Our longest serving reporter, Noor Hindi, who is a Palestinian American young woman who's also a poet and amazing in a variety of different ways. She started with us when she was 20 years old, picking up stories about small businesses and arts and culture. And now she's doing pieces on redlining and food deserts and infant mortality in the African American community, and in doing deep, difficult work, but telling those stories from a place rooted in being a member of the community in Akron. So we don't have that division. So I think, yeah, it's absolutely possible. It is a work in progress for us. So I don't ever want to make it sound like we know what we're doing. We're trying. We're always trying to learn. But we are building our entire model around equity. That is the idea. So yeah, I'll stop rambling and everyone else will jump in there. Sorry.
One thing that Chris didn't answer, and I don't know that I have the answer either, but is to the other part of your question relating to not relying on freelancers or paying people enough that they can make a living at this and not just do it as a sideline. And I think that's a pretty fundamental question. And to my knowledge, others on the panel may be more knowledgeable than I. I think that the kind of nonprofit startup model has only worked in certain places in that way and hasn't really found a good answer to that question. I think that the hope is that you can raise enough from the foundations or certain other people like that on a short-term basis to kind of transition to some other model. And maybe what Chris puts forward as a cooperative model over time would create enough revenue that you could do that. But I fundamentally think that you're really going to have public investment. The BBC in Britain has for decades relied on people making, hundreds of dollars a year to be able to watch TV. And, we've had public investment in one form or another of this type in the United States for a couple of hundred years. It's not a new idea. So I think it takes really all of us and so many others demanding that take place, and then allow for this to be an occupation where people can make enough money to live on, and they don't have to be living hand to mouth and, maybe getting along for a year or two because they're living in their parents' basement or whatever it might be, so that it's a sustainable occupation, which it isn't even as much these days in the mainstream as Caitlin has indicated.
Yeah, and I just wanted to speak to that real quick. I mean, we do use freelancers, but that's only because we're so tiny. I mean, we are the seventh largest state, but we just saw Oklahoma Watch, and they have an outfit that's about 10 times our size. So, but even in the best case scenario, I mean, ProPublica, they have 143 people working there. They have over $100 million budget. Even so, I mean, even 143 people, that's not even all reporters. The Plain Dealer at its height had 340 journalists. So, it's definitely not the whole answer. It's more of a way to kind of fill in that public service gap. I think there's a lot of places out there that are doing it very well. They're able to reflect their community very well once they have, a bigger staff and so on and so forth. And I think there's a lot of, untapped things that we just haven't looked at yet. I mean, I love, Zach's idea of going from our public funding, but just, or just an endowment, something like that. I mean, one of the Google founders at the end of the year had $400 million extra dollars he didn't know what to do with, that he parked in the DAF like at the very end of December. Like there's a lot of opportunities there to kind of connect the tech community, which doesn't necessarily see journalism as something that they should support, or they haven't seen themselves as media companies, even though they are vastly disseminating lots of information. So I would not agree with that.
And I think that brings up a good question that somebody had is, we're definitely all journalists, and we know how to do editorial and write stories. But Aaron King wrote a good question about what would be more effective to choose one or two requests what would it be more effective to choose one or two requests / ideas to rally around and really push? So is there stuff that we should be saying? Should we be rallying around, just, pushing out? And is there two good ideas that we need to really focus on as journalists and as trying to advocate for journalism?
Yeah, I mean, I think Aaron is correct. It would, from any sort of like messaging or campaign standpoint, you want to have people singing from the same songbook. Zach and I will tell you what we think, and we very clearly think, I mean, that there's an important role for nonprofit journalism, but we think that there needs to be structural change, and that can only be brought about by public policies. And if you view journalism as a public good, and from your Econ 101 days, that's something that has all these positive extra benefits that flow out of it, even if you're not the direct consumer of it. Your neighbor, your mother, your sister, whatever, they're all benefiting from the present of journalism. If you believe that journalism does those things, that means that it should have that is the role of the public sector to come in and support it. That's the whole theory behind government. So yeah, I think it would be very effective if different interest groups could get together and say, hey, the News Guild already has its ask for the stimulus. Free Press has its ask. If SPJ could figure out what makes sense for them, but to align with other groups that are already doing something, I think that would be much more. No, somebody asked from the cat. Excuse me, Caitlin, may we hear from the cat? He often joins me for my webinars that I do these days. I mean, if it's not the cat, it's the baby. But yeah, I'd say it would be great. And Zach and I am sure would welcome anybody who wants some help to think through what policies might make sense. What's the right ask for state legislators? What's the right ask for members of Congress? That's what we do. So we'd be happy to help with that.
And I think to piggyback off that, what is your next step on on the recommendations? What is the next step on the policy matter recommendations that you put out to, put out to us?
Well, Zach's been doing some work on that. And then we've been talking as a staff about, we are going to be at some point like putting out, a vision for a post-COVID Ohio. And that will be a big slate of policy recommendations that's going to touch on a lot of different areas. And so, where is this going to fit into that? That's something Zach and I and our others need to talk through. But Zach has been doing a lot of stuff behind the scenes, really. And maybe you want to share a little bit of that, Zach?
I'm not sure exactly what you're referring to, but
I've been making calls.
well, I mean, for example, last year, I tried to see if the state would invest some more in public broadcasting. And at least I gather got that point raised with the governor. I don't know that he decided to do anything about it, but I don't know if that's what you're thinking of or if some other efforts that are escaping me at the moment. But
yeah, when you were talking about, oh my gosh, I can't remember the guy that's on the broadcasting board.
Oh yeah, right. Well, Bob Smith is the head of Jobs Ohio, which is the privatized state economic development unit. And he also happens to be the head of the Broadcast Educational Media Commission, which is the state entity through which state money goes to public broadcasting. I think he used to also be the head of the board of the, not IdeaStream, but the public television, WVIZ. So he has a long time interest in public broadcasting and is very much involved in state economic development efforts. So after the Vindicator closing was announced, I went to him and asked, what do you think? Can we do something about this? And, he had some interest. It hasn't resulted yet in some clear path, but, I think it shows you should use whatever, whatever means are available to you and think of everyone who has some interest in this. And maybe together they will all unite at some point.
We are at the 8:13 mark, and I just want to ask one last question to the panelists, and I want to say thank you to everyone for joining us. I think this was all really helpful information, and I mean, the last question that each panelist can answer somewhat quickly, and I'm going to have Lucia answer first, actually. What is your vision for the future of journalism?
I think we really need to have enough of a staff that we can actually cover things, regularly. We have a lot of stuff that's kind of slipping through the cracks just because, no one is able to go out there. I mean, our model is, we don't cover things every day. We don't necessarily, we're not on a budget where, we have to fill a hole. So that's, a big advantage where we can kind of step back and take a look at things. So there's several areas that I really wish that we could cover a lot more. We did a thing on, it's called the Good River series, because apparently that's the translation of Ohio. So we did a big series on water, and that was really popular. And, a lot of people want to know what's in our water. Oh my gosh, and, now I'm getting calls, well, what's in our air? I'm like, oh, we should really do that too. If you go to the State House, and there are journalists working, around the State House, but in the actual press room, there's like one person working at a desk. So, there's a huge legislature there that we're just not covering because, we don't have the manpower to do that. So, I think it's definitely possible. It's been done in other states, and I think our goal is to kind of bring Ohio up to par and kind of focus on the methods that we can use to get there.
I would say that I would hope that many of the communities which have not always been treated very well by what we now call the mainstream media would actually be engaged in it, and that we would find new ways that people have often been not only neglected, but oftentimes tormented or treated poorly, would see that they not only have a place, but they should have a leading place in deciding what news is. And, we're a long ways away from that, but that would be my hope.
That's something that Doug Oplinger, formerly of the Akron Beacon Journal and now with Your Voice Ohio, is really making, a core part of his work to try to rebuild the trust in communities that, aren't treated very well by the media, like the Black community, people with low incomes. It sounds like that seems like an organization to check out for people that are interested in that work.
Yosef, again, what do you think is the vision of the future for journalism?
Well, in my perfect world, I would probably start out by saying we need to reinvigorate how journalists engage with communities. It's really summarizing what other folks have said. But once we establish that relationship between journalists and the community, where more of our stories and diverse stories are being told, it will start highlighting a lot of the existing inequities we have in our society that can hopefully be resolved one day. So that's the high level goal. And then trickling down from that, we have to stop greenlighting every single merger that's killing the industry right now. It's really a big problem from private equities and media conglomerates just laying off reporters and then shuttering newsrooms. And then the last thing is, as Caitlin mentioned, we have to start treating the journalism as a public good. So that's not just throwing a bunch of money at the journalism industry, but it's actually figuring out what policies make sense to promote local news, competition in the industry, diversity. And these are the prongs that the FCC is actually mandated to promote when it comes to local media. And that's something that we're trying to figure out right now. What does localism mean as in the relationship between a local outlet and the community? What does competition mean? What does diversity mean?
But just to piggyback real quick, Yosef, you can answer this. How, as journalists, how can we help that though? Like, what can we do as journalists? Like, I'm in the position, like most people aren't in the position of being editors or being in administration. How can journalists really, advocate for themselves and make sure that these big companies aren't merging and we're trying to put out that message that we are important?
Yeah, I think it's hard. What we've encouraged is journalists have to start writing about the state of their own craft. And you have a few like Margaret Sullivan or I think Ben Smith of the New York Times who are writing about the state of the news industry as ongoing columns, but we actually need local reporters to step up and start talking about this. I think the challenge is a lot of times they're muzzled by the parent companies from saying anything. For example, we held our town hall event in Dayton. We had reporters from the Dayton Daily News come attend, but they didn't write about it. They didn't say anything because they knew they couldn't. And so we have to start giving journalists the platform or the safe space to speak out about the problems they see. And that could be in the form of editorials or columns. I know there was a paper in Colorado, I can't remember the name of it, it was in Denver, Colorado, where they were taken over by private equity. And the reporters came together and just wrote saying, save us from our private equity parent company because they're killing our paper. And we don't want that situation where it's save us before it's too late. It's let's start speaking about this now so we can figure out how to solve the problem. And if they're not part of the solution, then it only makes the problem worse.
Right. I'd also say Form a union. Yeah. A lot of newsrooms are doing it. It's happening in digital outlets as well, and give you a stronger voice in your place of work. And yeah.
And the last person we didn't hear from is Chris about the vision of journalism. And then we're going to all have to go. It's 8:21. I know everyone has things. And this has been a great panel. And I really appreciate everyone for sticking around. Chris, I'm going to have you have the almost last word about what you think the vision of journalism is.
Personally, I would like it to be democratic, participatory, and humanizing. I think we talk a lot as an industry about how important we are to democracy, but we don't practice it. To piggyback on to Caitlin's comment about forming a union, one of the reasons we are a co-op is because it's basically a union for your community. Give your community and the people in it a way to have a say in in local news without having to walk away from the product when they don't like what's happening. It's and giving them something to do, some way to be involved, some way to help. I mean, the people who are members of our co-op so far, even though it's still very small, are dedicated and loyal and passionate about making the Devil Strip better. So I would say that, and then I don't know. Yeah, not to sound like a total jerk and go out on this note, but like I believe that legacy local news that is investor owned is going to die, and it probably needs to, and it needs to be brought up, from the ground up, because trying to change that monster when the incentives aren't there for the companies that own it, it's just going to be too difficult. And so I'd like to see more folks taking the initiative, like Lucia, and hopefully something in Cleveland soon, out of the ashes of the shit that's gone on there. Pardon my French. I'll stop.
No worry about your French. We've all spoken. So. I want to say thank you again. Thank you to the panelists. Again, we are SBJ of Cleveland, the Cleveland Pro Chapter, Society of Professional Journalists, and I'm sorry. Hold on. Okay. I guess I'm not sharing my screen. All right. Sorry about that. So, check us out, the SBJ .org. SBJ is doing a lot of great things as well. They have a lot of great toolkits. So don't forget about SBJ. And we're definitely, we want to stay on top of this issue as well. We're going to be hopefully having some more webinars, and again, thank you to all our panelists. Thank you to all the participants today. And I hope you guys all stay well and have a great night. And thanks again. But hopefully we'll be seeing you guys soon for some more webinars.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you.
Is everybody gone? Yeah.
I'm still here. And I think we're still live, right?
Oh yeah, we are. Okay, I'm going to end it before we debrief publicly. Okay, goodbye.
Bye.